Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets.
Isolde adjusted the straps of her shopping bags, the weight of new dresses and a leather journal pressing against her shoulders. At 27, a freelance illustrator, she'd spent a crisp March afternoon in 2025 browsing the city's boutique district, a rare treat from her usual homebound routine. The station clock read 8:47 p.m. as she hurried toward Platform 3, her breath visible in the chilly air. The 9 p.m. train to her suburban town, a 35-minute ride, was her last option, and the platform was eerily quiet, the evening shoppers long gone. She boarded the train, its outdated design creaking under her steps, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The carriage was sparsely populated, two elderly women chatting near the front, a man in a business suit typing furiously, and a teenager with headphones slumped against a window. Isolde chose a seat midway, settling her bags beside her, and pulled out her phone to text her roommate, Talia. "Just got on the train. Home soon," she typed, her fingers cold as she hit send. The train lurched forward, the city lights fading into the dark expanse of the countryside. Isolde gazed out the window, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks soothing her, when a shadow moved at the carriage's far end. She glanced up, spotting a figure in a tattered coat lingering near the connecting door to the next section, his face obscured by a hood. The train's layout included older, unused carriages at the back cordoned off for maintenance, and this man seemed out of place, his posture tense. She dismissed it as a worker, her attention drifting back to her phone, but a faint unease settled in her chest. The intercom crackled, the conductor's voice distorted. "Next stop, Thornfield, in 20 minutes. Isolde nodded to herself, the journey familiar, but her phone buzzed with an unexpected message from an unknown number. She opened it, her breath catching. A photo of her sitting in her seat, her face illuminated by the phone screen, taken from the shadowed end of the carriage. The caption read, "You shouldn't be alone, Isolde." Her name, typed so casually, sent a shiver down her spine. She looked up, her eyes searching, and the figure in the tattered coat was gone, the connecting door swaying slightly. Her heart raced as she replayed the message, the photo disappearing after the second view, a cruel mimicry of Snapchat's design. She stood, her bags rustling, and peered down the carriage, but the man was nowhere in sight. The elderly women continued their chat, oblivious, and the businessman typed on, his focus unbroken. Isolde sat back down, her hands trembling, and considered moving forward, but the train's motion and the distance to the next carriage felt like a barrier. She clutched her phone, debating whether to call Talia, when the lights flickered, plunging the carriage into brief darkness. When they returned, the figure stood at the far end again, his hood lowered just enough to reveal a scarred cheek and a smirk that promised danger. Isolde's stomach dropped. She was trapped with someone who knew her, and the next stop was still 18 minutes away. Isolde's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the man, his scarred cheek a stark contrast to the dim light. He took a step forward, his boots scuffing the floor, and Isolde's instincts screamed to move. She grabbed her bags, her movements jerky, and edged toward the front of the carriage, her eyes darting to the emergency button on the wall, 6 steps away past 2 rows of seats. The elderly women glanced up, their conversation pausing, but they didn't intervene, their faces etched with mild curiosity rather than alarm. The man stopped, tilting his head, his smirk widening as if he enjoyed her panic. Isolde's phone buzzed again, another message from the unknown number. She opened it with shaking hands, a photo of her mid-step, her fear etched on her face, captioned, "Run if you want. I'll catch you." Her breath hitched, and she dropped her phone into her bag, her mind racing. He was toying with her, documenting her every move, and the train's isolation amplified her terror. She reached the emergency button, her fingers hovering over it, but hesitated. Pulling it would stop the train, alerting the conductor, but it might also trap her longer with this man if he acted before help arrived. The businessman looked up, frowning, and Isolde seized the chance. "That man's following me," she whispered, pointing toward the scarred figure. The businessman's eyes narrowed, and he stood, his voice firm. "Hey, back off." The man raised his hands, feigning innocence, and retreated toward the connecting door, but not before sending a final glance Isolde's way. A promise, not a retreat. She sank into a seat near the businessman, her chest heaving, and he offered a curt nod. "I'll stay with you. Call the conductor." Isolde dialed the emergency line, her voice trembling as she described the man and the photos, the conductor promising security at Thornfield. The train rattled on, 15 minutes from the stop, and Isolde prayed for safety. But the lights flickered again, longer this time, and when they steadied, the man was closer, 3 rows away, his tattered coat brushing the seats. He held something in his hand, glinting faintly metal, possibly a knife, and Isolde's stomach churned. The businessman stood again, his voice louder. "I said back off." The man paused, his smirk fading, and slipped through the connecting door, the sound of his footsteps echoing into the derelict section beyond. Isolde's relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed with another photo, this one of the businessman confronting the man, captioned, "He can't save you." She showed it to her companion, his face darkening. "He's in the back carriages," he said. "Those sections are off-limits, dangerous, unlit. We need to stay put." Isolde nodded, her fear a tight knot. But the train's isolation and the man's persistence promised a threat she couldn't outrun. Isolde clung to the businessman's presence, his name. Kieran, he'd finally offered, bolstering her courage as the train hurtled toward Thornfield. The elderly women had moved closer, their concern evident, forming a small circle of protection around her. Kieran kept his eyes on the connecting door, his phone ready to record if the man returned. The carriage felt like a fragile sanctuary, the hum of the tracks a constant reminder of their isolation. Her phone buzzed again, a video this time, grainy footage of the derelict carriages, their seats torn, windows cracked, and a figure moving in the shadows. The caption read, "Join me back here, Isolde." Her stomach lurched, the invitation a threat masked as a game. She showed Kieran, his jaw tightening. "He's luring you," he said. "Don't go. The police will handle it at the stop." But the train jolted, the lights dimming briefly, and a scream pierced the air from the direction of the derelict section. The elderly women gasped, and Kieran stood, peering through the door's glass. "Someone's back there," he muttered, his voice tense. Isolde's mind raced. Had the man attacked another passenger, or was this part of his plan to draw her out? The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted but urgent. "Remain seated. Security is en route. Thornfield, 10 minutes. The connecting door creaked open, and the man stepped through, his scarred cheek glistening with sweat, his knife now visible in his hand. The elderly women shrieked, retreating, but Isolde froze, her bags a barrier between her and the threat. Kieran lunged, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall, and sprayed it at the man, the white foam blinding him. The man staggered, cursing, and retreated again, the door slamming shut behind him. Isolde's hands shook as she dialed the conductor again, her voice breaking. "He's armed. He tried to attack us." The conductor promised immediate action, but the train's speed and the derelict section's isolation meant help was still minutes away. Kieran handed her the extinguisher, his breath ragged. "If he comes back, use this. I'll watch the door." Isolde nodded, her fear giving way to a desperate resolve. She wouldn't let this man take her without a fight. The train's rhythm steadied, but the tension in the carriage thickened as Isolde gripped the extinguisher, her knuckles white. Kieran stood guard, his eyes fixed on the connecting door, the elderly women huddled behind them, their murmurs a soft undercurrent. The man's retreat had bought them time, but his presence in the derelict section loomed large, a predator circling his prey. Isolde's phone remained silent, the lack of new messages more unsettling than the photos themselves. She didn't know his next move. The lights flickered again, a prolonged dimness that plunged the carriage into near darkness, and the connecting door burst open. The man charged, his knife raised, his scarred face twisted in rage. Kieran swung the extinguisher, the metal connecting with the man's shoulder, but he slashed wildly, the blade grazing Kieran's arm. Blood stained his sleeve, and Isolde screamed, spraying the extinguisher's foam, the cloud enveloping the man as he stumbled back. The elderly women shouted for help, one fumbling with her phone to call the conductor, while Isolde and Kieran wrestled the man toward the door. He was stronger than expected, his knife slashing again, catching Isolde's bag and tearing it open, her journal spilling across the floor. She grabbed it, swinging it at his head, the leather connecting with a thud. The man staggered, and Kieran shoved him through the door, slamming it shut and wedging a seat cushion against the handle. Kieran clutched his arm, blood seeping through his fingers, and Isolde tore a strip from her scarf to bind it, her hands shaking. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We need to hold him off until Thornfield." The conductor's voice crackled again. Security boarding now. "Hold on." The train was 5 minutes from the stop, but the man pounded on the door, his muffled threats audible. "You're mine, Isolde." Each blow a reminder of the danger. The train screeched to a halt at Thornfield Station, the platform lights piercing the darkness like a lifeline, casting long shadows across the carriage. Isolde's hands trembled as she clutched the fire extinguisher, the foam residue sticky on her palms, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. Kieran sat slumped beside her, his arm wrapped in her makeshift scarf bandage, the blood seeping through the fabric a stark reminder of the violence they'd endured. The elderly women, whose names Isolde had learned were Marigold and Aloan, huddled together, their faces pale but resolute, their hands clasped in a silent prayer of gratitude. The connecting door to the derelict section rattled with Torvald's final, desperate kicks, but the cushion Kieran had wedged against the handle held firm, a fragile barrier between them and the predator who'd terrorized them for the past 30 minutes. The carriage doors hissed open, and 3 security officers stormed in, their batons drawn, their voices sharp with authority. "Step back! Hands where we can see them!" the lead officer shouted, his eyes scanning the chaos. Isolde dropped the extinguisher, raising her hands instinctively, her body shaking as the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving her hollow. Kieran groaned, his head tilting back against the seat, and the officer nearest him lowered his baton, his expression softening as he saw the blood. "We've got an injured passenger here," he called, waving for the paramedics who followed close behind, their medical kits clanking with urgency. The third officer approached the connecting door, his baton tapping against the glass, and Torvald's silhouette froze on the other side, his scarred face twisted in a snarl. "Drop the weapon and come out now," the officer commanded, his voice a low growl. Torvald hesitated, his knife glinting in the dim light, but the sound of handcuffs being unclipped seemed to break his resolve. He dropped the blade with a clatter, raising his hands as the officer kicked the door open, the cushion tumbling to the floor. Torvald was dragged out, his tattered coat catching on the doorframe, his eyes locking onto Isolde with a hatred that made her skin crawl. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice rasping as the officers cuffed him, his wrists twisting against the metal. Isolde exhaled, her knees buckling as she sank into the seat, her shopping bags scattered around her, the leather journal she'd bought that afternoon lying open on the floor, its pages crumpled. Marigold reached over, her hand trembling but warm, and squeezed Isolde's shoulder. "You're safe now, dear," she said, her voice quivering with relief. Aloan nodded, her eyes wet with tears, and handed Isolde a tissue from her purse, the small act of kindness grounding her amidst the chaos. Isolde wiped her face, her tears mixing with the sweat on her cheeks, and managed a shaky, "Thank you." The paramedics tended to Kieran, their voices calm but efficient as they cleaned his wound, the graze from Torvald's knife deeper than Isolde had realized. "You'll need stitches," one of them said, a young woman with a steady gaze, as she applied a temporary bandage. Kieran nodded, his face pale but his jaw set, and glanced at Isolde with a tired smile. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse, and Isolde felt a surge of gratitude for his bravery, his presence a shield against the terror she'd faced. The officers took Torvald to the platform, where 2 more police officers waited, their radios crackling with updates. Isolde watched through the window as they forced him into a squad car, his head bowed, his scarred cheek catching the light one last time before the door slammed shut. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Gavin, returned to the carriage, his notebook in hand, and began taking statements. Isolde recounted everything, the photos, the messages, the attack. Her voice trembling but clear, her phone handed over as evidence, the chilling images of her on the train preserved in its memory. Gavin listened intently, his pen scratching across the page, and when Isolde finished, he flipped his notebook shut, his expression grim. "His name's Torvald Hensley," he said, his voice low. "He's got a rap sheet, stalking, assault, mostly targeting women on public transit. We've been after him for months, but he's slippery, always disappearing into abandoned areas like those back carriages. Isolde's stomach churned, the realization sinking in that she'd been a target in a predator's pattern, her shopping trip a cruel twist of fate. Kieran, now on a stretcher as the paramedics prepared to take him to the hospital, added his account, his voice steady despite the pain. "He came at us with a knife," he said, gesturing to his arm. "If Isolde hadn't used that extinguisher, it would have been worse." Gavin nodded, his eyes flicking to the extinguisher on the floor, and jotted down a note. "You both did good," he said, his tone a mix of respect and concern. "We'll need you to come to the station for a full statement, but for now, let's get you safe." Isolde nodded, her body heavy with exhaustion, and glanced at her phone as Gavin handed it back, the screen now locked with a police evidence code. She thought of Talia, who'd be waiting at home, oblivious to the nightmare Isolde had endured, and longed for the comfort of her roommate's presence. "I need to call my friend," she said, her voice small, and Gavin pointed to a payphone on the platform, the station's modern amenities a stark contrast to the train's outdated design. She stepped off the train, her legs unsteady, the platform cold beneath her sneakers, and dialed Talia, her fingers fumbling with the coins. "I'm at Thornfield," she said when Talia answered, her voice breaking. "I was attacked on the train. Can you come get me?" Talia's gasp was audible, her words tumbling out in a rush of worry, and she promised to be there in 20 minutes, her car already starting in the background. Isolde hung up, her breath visible in the night air, and leaned against the payphone, her eyes scanning the platform for any sign of danger, the memory of Torvald's gaze seared into her mind. The police continued their work, searching the derelict carriages for evidence, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Isolde overheard Gavin speaking to another officer, his voice low but urgent. "He had a partner," Gavin said, his words sending a chill down Isolde's spine. "Someone tech-savvy, sending those photos. We didn't catch them, they weren't on the train." The second officer nodded, his face grim, and Isolde's heart sank, the victory of Torvald's arrest tainted by a new fear. Someone else was out there, watching her, waiting. She returned to the carriage to gather her things, Marigold and Aloan offering her their numbers, their kindness a small light in the darkness. Kieran was wheeled away, his hand raised in a weak wave, and Isolde promised to visit him at the hospital, their shared ordeal a bond she couldn't ignore. As she stepped back onto the platform, her shopping bags heavier than ever, she felt the weight of the night settle on her shoulders, the train's derelict section a haunting reminder of the danger she'd faced. Talia's car pulled up, her face pale with worry, and Isolde collapsed into her arms, the tears finally falling as the station lights faded behind them, the train a ghost in her memory. Isolde woke the next morning to the soft light filtering through her apartment window, the familiar hum of Talia making coffee in the kitchen a stark contrast to the terror of the previous night. She lay in bed, her body aching from the tension, her mind replaying every moment on the train, the photos, Torvald's scarred face, the knife glinting in the dim light. Her shopping bags sat untouched in the corner, the leather journal she'd bought a reminder of the day that had spiraled into a nightmare. She pulled the blanket tighter, her hands still trembling, and forced herself to get up, the need for routine a desperate anchor against the fear. Talia greeted her with a mug of coffee, her eyes red from lack of sleep, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to talk about it yet," she said, setting the mug on the table. "But I'm here when you're ready." Isolde nodded, her throat tight, and took a sip, the warmth grounding her as she recounted the night in halting, whispered words, the messages, the attack, Kieran's bravery, Torvald's arrest. Talia listened, her hand squeezing Isolde's, her face a mix of anger and fear. "You're safe now," she said, her voice trembling. "He's behind bars." But Isolde couldn't shake Gavin's words. Torvald had a partner, someone who'd sent the photos, someone still out there. She checked her phone, now returned by the police, and found a missed call from Gavin, his voicemail asking her to come to the station for a follow-up. She dressed quickly, her movements mechanical, and Talia drove her, the city streets a blur as Isolde's eyes scanned every corner, every stranger, for a sign of danger. The station was bustling, officers moving with purpose, and Gavin met them in a small interview room, his face grim but professional. "We've got Torvald on multiple charges," he said, flipping through a file. "Stalking, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted abduction." He's not getting out anytime soon. But his phone gave us a lead on the accomplice. The messages were sent through a burner app, routed through multiple servers, but we traced the origin to a local IP address. We're closing in. Isolde nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but the news offered little comfort. The accomplice knew her name, her routines, her face. Gavin handed her a card with a victim support hotline, his voice softening. You did the right thing coming forward. We'll find this guy. In the meantime, stay vigilant, change your locks, avoid public transit for now. Isolde took the card, her fingers cold, and thanked him, her mind racing with the implications. She'd survived Torvald, but this unseen shadow was a new kind of terror, one that followed her beyond the train into her life. Talia suggested they visit Kieran at the hospital, a small distraction from the looming threat, and Isolde agreed, needing the connection to someone who understood. They found him in a recovery ward, his arms stitched and bandaged, his face lighting up as they entered. You made it, he said, his voice stronger, and Isolde managed a smile, her gratitude for his bravery a warmth amidst the cold fear. They talked for an hour, sharing their relief, their fears, and Kieran's determination to testify against Torvald, his resolve mirroring her own. But the fear returned that evening as Isolde sat at her desk, sketching to calm her nerves, the pencil strokes jagged with tension. Her phone buzzed, a new message from an unknown number. A photo of her apartment window, taken from the street below, captioned, I'm still watching. Her heart stopped, her breath shallow as she dropped the pencil, her eyes darting to the window. The street was dark, the shadows deep, but a figure stood beneath a streetlight, their face obscured, their posture chillingly familiar. She called Gavin, her voice shaking, and he dispatched a patrol car. But the figure was gone by the time they arrived. The message traced to another burner phone. The accomplice's taunt a cruel echo of Torvald's terror. Isolde installed new locks, her hands trembling as she turned the key, and Talia insisted on sleeping on the couch, her presence a comfort, but not a cure. The next day, Isolde joined a self-defense class, her body learning to fight back even as her mind battled fear. She attended Torvald's hearing a week later, his guilty plea a small victory, but the court revealed more. His accomplice, known only as Shade, had a history of cyberstalking, using technology to terrorize victims, a ghost in the digital world. Gavin promised to keep searching, but Isolde knew the danger was far from over. She started a support group for transit victims, her experience a bridge to others, her voice growing stronger as she shared her story. But the messages continued, photos of her at the grocery store, the park, each one a reminder of Shade's reach. She bought pepper spray, her hand resting on it as she walked to therapy one evening, the city's rhythm a backdrop to her vigilance. Her phone buzzed again, a photo of her on the sidewalk captioned, You can't hide. Isolde's heart raced, but she squared her shoulders, her eyes scanning the shadows, her grip tightening on the spray. The nightmare wasn't over, but she was ready to fight, her story ending with her stepping forward, her fear of fire fueling her resolve, the unseen shadow a challenge she wouldn't back down from. Jorvik adjusted his backpack, the straps digging into his shoulders as he guided his family onto the Midnight Express bound for the coastal resort town of Calverna. It was a sweltering July night in 2025, the air thick with humidity as the 40-year-old environmental consultant ushered his wife, Lysandra, 38, a librarian, and their children, Irwin, 13, and Tavish, 10, toward their sleeper cabin. The 14-hour journey promised a scenic escape from their inland city, a vacation Lysandra had planned for months, her excitement palpable despite the late hour. The train platform buzzed with last-minute travelers, their voices a low hum against the engine's rumble, and Jorvik felt a rare sense of anticipation as they boarded, the cabin's narrow door clicking shut behind them. The family settled in, the small space lit by a single overhead lamp, its warm glow casting shadows over the fold-down bunks. Irwin claimed the top bunk, her nose already buried in a fantasy novel, while Tavish unpacked a deck of cards, his chatter about the beach filling the air. Lysandra unpacked a thermos of herbal tea, her hands steady as she poured, and Jorvik stretched out on the lower bunk, his mind drifting to the coastal trails he'd hiked. The train jolted forward at 11:30 p.m., the city lights fading into the dark expanse of rolling hills, the rhythmic clack of the tracks a lullaby for the tired family. But as Jorvik gazed out the window, a figure passed their cabin, his silhouette framed by the corridor's dim light. The man wore a faded trench coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his pace was deliberate, almost predatory. Jorvik frowned, a flicker of unease stirring. He'd seen that coat earlier, loitering near the ticket counter, its owner watching their family with an intensity that lingered. He dismissed it as paranoia, the late hour playing tricks on him, and turned to Lysandra, who smiled softly, oblivious to his thoughts. The cabin grew quiet as the children drifted to sleep, Arwen's book slipping from her hands, Tavish's cards scattered across the bunk. Lysandra nestled beside Jorvik, her head on his shoulder, and he felt the tension ease, the train's motion a gentle rock. But then a sharp knock rattled the door, jolting them upright. Jorvik opened it cautiously, finding the corridor empty, but a folded note lay on the floor, its edges creased. He picked it up, his heart sinking as he read the scrawled words. "You can't escape me, Jorvik. This ends tonight." Lysandra's eyes widened, her hand gripping his arm, and Jorvik's mind raced. Someone knew his name, and their vacation had just turned into a nightmare. Jorvik stared at the note, the ink smudged but the threat clear, his pulse quickening as he locked the cabin door, the click echoing in the small space. Lysandra's breath hitched, her voice a whisper. "Who would do this? We don't know anyone here." Jorvik shook his head, his mind sifting through possibilities. A disgruntled colleague, a past client, but nothing fit. Irwin stirred on her bunk, her eyes blinking open, and Tavish mumbled in his sleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Jorvik folded the note, tucking it into his pocket, and decided to alert the conductor, his instincts urging action over fear. He slipped out of the cabin, the corridor dark and silent, the train's sway unsteady beneath his feet. The family sleeper section was a maze of identical doors, and Jorvik moved quickly, his sneakers muffled on the carpet, until he reached the dining car. The space was nearly empty, a lone waiter wiping tables, and Jorvik approached the counter, his voice low. "I need to speak to the conductor. It's an emergency." The waiter nodded, his face impassive, and disappeared into the back, returning minutes later with a stout man in a navy uniform, his badge reading Conductor Hadrian. Hadrian listened as Jorvik explained the note, his expression hardening. "We've had no reported trouble tonight," he said, taking the note with gloved hands. "But I'll check the passenger list and increase patrols. Stay in your cabin, lock the door, and call if anything else happens." Jorvik nodded, his gratitude mixed with unease, and returned to his family, the corridor feeling longer, the shadows deeper. Back in the cabin, Lysandra had woken the children, her face pale as she whispered the situation. Irwin clutched her book, her eyes wide with fear, while Tavish clung to his mother, his usual bravado gone. Jorvik reassured them, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest, and they settled into a tense silence, the train's rhythm a stark contrast to their anxiety. But then a shadow passed the window, the man in the trench coat again, his hat tilted to conceal his face, his hand brushing the glass. Jorvik leapt up, his heart pounding, but the figure vanished, leaving only the reflection of their frightened faces. Lysandra's phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, a photo of their cabin window captioned, "I see you, Jorvik." Her gasp drew the children's attention, and Jorvik snatched the phone, his anger flaring. The image was time-stamped minutes ago, proof the man was close, watching them. He called Hadrian, his voice urgent, and the conductor promised to search the train, but the vastness of the 14-hour route, spanning rural plains and dense forests, meant help was slow to come. Jorvik armed himself with a flashlight from his pack, its beam a weak defense, and stood by the door, his family's safety his only focus. Jorvik stood guard, the flashlight's beam cutting through the cabin's dimness, his eyes fixed on the door as the train rumbled through the night. Lysandra sat with the children, her arms around them, her voice a soft murmur of reassurance, but the tension was palpable, the note and photo a constant threat. Irwin whispered, "Dad, who is he?" Her voice trembling, and Jorvik shook his head, his mind racing through his past. A decade as a consultant, exposing corporate polluters, making enemies, but no face matched the man in the trench coat. The train slowed for a rural stop, the platform a brief flash of light, and Jorvik peered out, spotting the man lingering near the edge, his hat casting a shadow over his face. Hadrian's voice crackled over the intercom. All passengers remain seated. Security check in progress. Jorvik exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. The man boarded again, his figure disappearing into the next carriage, his intent unclear but menacing. Jorvik called Hadrian, describing the sighting, and the conductor promised to send guards, but the train's length, 12 carriages, made the search a needle-in-a-haystack effort. Lysandra suggested moving to the dining car, a more public space, and Jorvik agreed, gathering their belongings, the family moving as a unit. The corridor was a gauntlet of shadows, each door a potential hiding place, and Jorvik kept the flashlight ahead, its beam trembling with his grip. They reached the dining car, its lights brighter, a handful of passengers sipping coffee, and Jorvik chose a table near the center, his back to the wall. Irwin and Tavish sat close, their eyes darting, while Lysandra scanned the room, her hand on Jorvik's arm. But then a waiter approached, his tray unsteady, and slipped a note onto their table before moving on. Jorvik unfolded it, his breath catching. "You ruined my family, Jorvik. Now I ruin yours." The words were a punch, a memory surfacing. 5 years ago, he'd testified against a factory owner, Eldrick Vane, whose illegal dumping had poisoned a community, leading to Vane's ruin and imprisonment. Could this be Vane's kin seeking revenge? The thought chilled him, and he showed Lysandra, her face paling as she nodded, the pieces clicking into place. A shadow moved at the carriage's edge, the man in the trench coat, his hat tilted, his eyes locking onto Jorvik. The family froze, the other passengers unaware, and Jorvik stood, his voice firm. "We need help," he shouted, drawing attention. The man retreated, but the threat lingered, the train's isolation amplifying their peril as it sped toward the next stop, hours away. Jorvik's shout echoed in the dining car, the passengers turning, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. But the man in the trench coat was gone, his shadow swallowed by the corridor's darkness. Hadrian rushed in, 2 guards flanking him, their expressions grim as Jorvik handed over the second note. "He's targeting us," Jorvik said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I think it's Eldrick Vane's son, revenge for my testimony." Hadrian's eyes narrowed, recognizing the name, and he ordered a full sweep of the train, his radio crackling with commands. Lysandra pulled the children closer, her hands trembling, and Jorvik scanned the room, the waiter who'd delivered the note nowhere in sight. Irwin whispered, "What if he hurts us?" her voice small, and Tavish clung to Lysandra, his face buried in her shoulder. Jorvik knelt, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll stay together. No one's getting to you." His words were a promise, but the train's isolation, hours from the next major stop, tested his resolve. The guards returned, their search fruitless, and Hadrian suggested moving the family to a secure staff cabin near the front, a reinforced room with a lock. Jorvik agreed, the dining car too exposed, and they gathered their things, the family moving as a tight unit, the guards leading the way. The corridor was a tunnel of shadows, the train's sway unsteady, and Jorvik kept the flashlight trained ahead, its beam catching every crevice. They reached the staff cabin, its door heavy, and locked it behind them, the click a small comfort. But the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness, and a thud sounded against the door, a heavy weight slamming into it. Jorvik shone the flashlight, revealing a dent, and Lysandra gasped, pulling the children back. The man's voice came through, muffled but venomous. "You took everything, Jorvik. My father's life, my future. Now your family pays." The door shuddered again, the lock straining, and Jorvik braced it with his body, his heart pounding. Irwin screamed, Tavish cried, and Lysandra grabbed a fire extinguisher, her hands shaking as she stood beside Jorvik. Hadrian radioed for backup, his voice urgent, but the train's remote route meant help was delayed. The man, confirmed by Hadrian as Brant Vane, Eldrick's son, kicked the door again, the wood splintering, and Jorvik swung the flashlight, its metal casing striking Brant's hand as it broke through. Brant howled, retreating, and the family braced for the next assault, the cabin a fragile fortress against a vendetta decades in the making. The splintered door creaked under Jorvik's weight, his shoulder pressed against it, the flashlight's beam trembling in his hand as Brant's footsteps retreated down the corridor. Lysandra stood beside him, the fire extinguisher clutched like a lifeline, her face a mask of determination despite the fear in her eyes. Irwin and Tavish huddled on the lower bunk, their sobs muffled against each other. the cabin's cramped space amplifying their terror. The train's rhythmic clatter was a cruel backdrop to their plight, the remote countryside outside offering no escape, the next stop still 4 hours away. Hadrian's voice crackled over the radio, his words clipped. Guards are searching, but he's evasive. Hold tight, we're diverting to an emergency stop. Jorvik nodded, though Hadrian couldn't see, his focus split between the door and his family. The lock held, but the dented wood was a weak point, and Brant's vendetta, fueled by Jorvik's testimony that had sent Eldrick Vane to prison, where he'd died, promised relentless pursuit. Jorvik's mind raced, guilt mingling with resolve. He'd protected the environment, but at what cost to his family now? The light steadied, but a shadow passed the window, Brant's trench coat visible for a moment before he vanished. Lysandra whispered, "He's planning something." Her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and Jorvik agreed, his eyes scanning for a weapon. The cabin offered little. A metal tray, a chair leg loosened from the bunk. But he armed himself with the tray, its edge sharp enough to deter. Irwin, her fear giving way to anger, handed him a pocket knife from her backpack, a camping tool she'd packed, and Jorvik took it, his gratitude silent but deep. The door shuttered again, Brant's weight slamming into it, and the lock groaned, the wood cracking further. Jorvik braced harder, Lysandra spraying the extinguisher through the gap, the foam hissing as it met resistance. Brant cursed, his voice closer, and a knife blade pierced the splintered wood, its tip glinting inches from Jorvik's face. Tavish screamed, Irwin covered his eyes, and Lysandra swung the extinguisher, the metal connecting with the blade, knocking it back. Jorvik lunged with the tray, its edge slicing Brant's hand, blood smearing the door as he retreated with a roar. The train slowed, the emergency stop announced, and guards burst in, their batons raised. They dragged Brant away, his trench coat torn, his face a mask of rage and pain, his hand bleeding profusely. Hadrian followed, his face grim, and confirmed Brant's identity. Eldrick Vane's son, released from juvenile detention months ago, his vendetta a years-long obsession. The family collapsed, their relief tempered by exhaustion, the cabin a battlefield they'd survived. Paramedics tended to Tavish's minor cuts from the chaos, and Jorvik held Lysandra, their embrace a silent vow to heal. The emergency stop left the family shaken, the train's interior a blur as they disembarked into the pre-dawn light, the rural platform a stark contrast to the coastal dream they'd chased. Jorvik supported Lysandra, her strength waning, while Irwin and Tavish clung to each other, their faces pale but resolute. Paramedics checked them over, the minor injuries, Tavish's cuts, Lysandra's bruised arm, treated on site, but the emotional scars ran deep. Hadrian apologized, his voice heavy with responsibility, and arranged for a police escort to a nearby hotel, the vacation canceled, the train a memory they'd bury. Jorvik sat in the hotel room, the curtains drawn, his mind replaying the night, Brant's threats, the knife, the photos. Lysandra rested beside him, her hand in his, while Irwin and Tavish slept on the pull-out sofa, their breaths uneven but steady. The police interviewed them, confirming Brant's arrest, his phone revealing a trove of surveillance. Photos of Jorvik's family, maps of their route, a vendetta meticulously planned. Officer Zephyr, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, assured them Brant would face charges, but her next words chilled Jorvik. He mentioned a partner, someone who helped him track you. We're searching, but they're still out there. The family returned home 2 days later, the coastal trip a distant hope, replaced by a fortress of new locks and security cameras. Jorvik took a leave from work, his focus on his family, their nights filled with therapy sessions to unravel the trauma. Irwin sketched the train, her art a catharsis, while Tavish rebuilt his card games, their resilience a quiet strength. Lysandra cooked, her kitchen a haven, but the fear lingered, every knock a potential threat. A week later, Jorvik's phone buzzed, a photo of their house, time-stamped that morning, captioned, "You can't hide forever." His blood ran cold, and he called Zephyr, who traced it to a burner phone, the partner's work. The police increased patrols, but the messages continued. Photos of Irwin at school, Tavish at the park, each one a reminder of the unseen threat. Jorvik installed an alarm system, his hands steady but his heart racing, and Lysandra joined a neighborhood watch, their community a shield. Jorvik started a blog, Surviving the Rails, sharing their story anonymously, warning others about transit dangers, his words a call for vigilance. The blog gained traction, comments from survivors offering support, and he found purpose in their pain. One evening, as he locked the doors, his phone buzzed again, a photo of him at the window captioned, "I'm closer." He reported it, the police suspecting a local ally of Brandt's, and though they promised action, the fear remained. The story ends with Jorvik standing at the window, his family asleep, his hand on the alarm, the night outside a silent enemy, his resolve to protect them unyielding. Silvaris adjusted his tie, the fabric slightly frayed from years of daily wear, its navy blue faded at the edges, a testament to his 5-year routine as he stepped onto the 7:15 a.m. train bound for the city center. It was a brisk April morning in 2025, the air carrying a hint of spring rain, the platform at his suburban station alive with commuters, their faces a mix of resignation and hurried purpose, briefcases swinging, coffee cups steaming. At 34, Silvaris was a data analyst for a mid-sized tech firm, his 50-minute commute a ritual he'd mastered, the predictability a comfort against the chaos of his workload. He navigated the crowd, his leather shoes clicking on the concrete, and found his usual spot in the third carriage, a window seat near the middle, the worn upholstery familiar beneath him. He pulled out his tablet, its screen glowing with reports, and slipped in his earbuds, a classical playlist, Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, drowning out the murmur of voices around him. The carriage was a microcosm of his daily life. Mrs. Fenella, a retired florist in her late 60s, occupied her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a green scarf, her silver hair catching the light. Torin, a barista at a downtown cafe, sat a few rows ahead, his apron peeking from his bag, his fingers scrolling through his phone with the intensity of a man avoiding reality. And a new passenger, a woman in a charcoal blazer, sat stiffly across the aisle her briefcase balanced on her lap, her fingers drumming a nervous tattoo against the leather. Silvaris noted her tension, her sharp cheekbones and wide eyes suggesting a first-day anxiety, and offered a polite nod, which she returned with a fleeting glance before turning to the window. He dismissed her unease, his focus returning to his tablet, the train pulling out with a familiar lurch, the suburbs rolling past in a blur of houses and trees. The morning light cast long shadows over the tracks, the train's rhythm a steady heartbeat, and Silvaris settled into his routine, the clack of the rails syncing with the music in his ears. He annotated a spreadsheet, his stylus moving with practiced ease, when a hushed conversation pierced his concentration, the voices low but sharp, cutting through Beethoven's crescendo. "The handover's at 8 o'clock. A man with a gravelly voice said, his tone clipped and authoritative. "No slip-ups or we're finished." A second man, his voice smoother, almost melodic, replied, "If she talks, we deal with her. Permanently." Silvaris froze, his stylus hovering, the music a distant hum as he risked a glance back. A man with a jagged scar across his neck sat beside another with a shaved head, their eyes darting toward the woman in the charcoal blazer, their intent a silent threat. His stomach tightened, a cold knot forming as the words sank in. A handover, a threat, a possible crime unfolding on his morning commute. Silvaris adjusted his earbuds, pretending to listen, but turned off the music, his ears straining to catch more. The scarred man continued, his voice dropping lower. "The boss wants the cash clean. If she doesn't deliver, we take her out at the station. Quietly, no mess." Silvaris's mind raced, the implications clear. Cash, a boss, a woman in danger. He glanced at her again, her face paler now, her fingers gripping the briefcase as if it held her life, her drumming a frantic pulse. The train's rhythm felt sinister, each stop a countdown to something deadly, and Silvaris knew he couldn't ignore it. He shifted in his seat, his tablet screen a facade, his heart pounding as he considered his next move. Confront the men, alert the conductor, or follow the woman to warn her. The carriage's hum grew oppressive, the weight of his discovery pressing down, his daily ritual now a tightrope walk over danger. Silvaris kept his head down, his tablet screen a glowing shield as he listened, the scarred man's words. "Take her out at the station," echoing in his mind like a drumbeat of doom. The woman in the charcoal blazer, her name still a mystery, stared out the window, her reflection showing wide, fearful eyes, her fingers drumming on her briefcase with a rhythm that betrayed her panic. Mrs. Fenella knitted on, her needles a soft counterpoint to the train's clatter, the green scarf growing longer, while Torin scrolled through his phone, his earbuds blocking the world, his apron a reminder of his mundane life. Silvaris felt isolated, the only one aware of the danger, his heart pounding as he weighed his options. Confronting the men risked his life, alerting the conductor might expose him, and following the woman could save her but draw attention. His hands trembled slightly, the tablet's edge cutting into his palm as he steadied himself. The train slowed for its first stop, a busy suburban hub where the platform teemed with commuters rushing toward the stairs, briefcases and bags swinging. The woman in the blazer stood, her movements jerky, her briefcase clutched tightly as she headed for the door, her heels clicking with urgency. The scarred man and his partner followed, their steps deliberate, their hands in their pockets, and Silvaris made a split-second decision. He grabbed his bag, its strap slipping on his sweaty palm, and trailed them, his pulse racing as he blended into the crowd. The platform's noise, announcements, footsteps, rolling suitcases, masked his movements, and he kept his distance, his eyes locked on the woman as she hurried toward a bench near the station's edge, her figure a target in the morning light. A man in a green jacket waited there, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd with the precision of a predator. The woman approached, her voice a low murmur as she spoke, handing him the briefcase with trembling hands, her fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go. Silvaris edged closer, hiding behind a pillar, its cold concrete grounding him, his phone recording the exchange, the audio faint but the intent clear. She was passing something, likely the cash the men had mentioned, her role a coerced pawn in a larger game. The scarred man and his partner watched from a distance, their faces hard, and Silvaris saw the glint of a gun in the scarred man's waistband, its outline a chilling promise beneath his jacket, the metal catching the light as he shifted. The handover complete, the man in the green jacket left, the briefcase tucked under his arm, his stride confident, but the scarred man signaled to his partner, and they moved toward the woman, their intent unmistakable. Silvaris's heart raced as he followed, his phone still recording, capturing their approach as they cornered her in a quiet alley off the platform, the brick walls closing in around them. "You better not talk," the scarred man growled, his gun now in hand, pressed against her side, the barrel a dark threat against her blazer. The woman nodded, her face pale, her voice a whisper. "I won't, I swear," her fear a tangible force. They shoved her against the wall, her cry muffled by a hand over her mouth, and Silvaris ducked behind a dumpster, his breath shallow, his recording capturing the assault as they struck her, her body crumpling to the ground. He called emergency services, his voice shaking as he reported the assault, his footage a lifeline for the police, his location whispered into the phone. "Hurry, she's hurt," he urged, his eyes on the woman, her chest rising faintly, her briefcase gone. The men retreated, their footsteps fading, and Silvaris waited, his phone still rolling, the alley's silence a stark contrast to the platform's bustle. Police arrived, their sirens cutting through the morning, and Silvaris handed over his evidence, his statement halting but clear. The woman, identified as Vespera, rushed to an ambulance, her survival a fragile hope. Silvaris returned to the train, his commute disrupted, his mind reeling. He'd witnessed a crime, and his involvement made him a target in a conspiracy he couldn't yet fathom. Silvaris stood on the platform, his hands trembling as the police secured the alley, the ambulance's lights flashing over Vespera's pale face as she was wheeled away, her survival uncertain, but her pulse steady. The officers took his statement, their notebooks filling with his account, the handover, the assault, the gun, his phone footage a key piece of evidence, its screen smudged with his fingerprints. Detective Nix, a wiry woman with a sharp gaze, listened intently, her pen scratching across the page, and confirmed the men's identities, Cashin, the scarred man, and Rune, his partner, enforcers for a local crime syndicate known for money laundering. Vespera, an accountant coerced into their scheme, had been their mule, the briefcase a drop-off point, the train a perfect cover for their operations. Vespera refused to press charges, her voice weak, but firm as she spoke to Nix from the ambulance stretcher, her fear of the syndicate's retaliation outweighing her pain. "They'll kill my family if I talk," she whispered, her eyes darting, and Silvaris understood, his own fear mirroring hers, his involvement a risk he hadn't anticipated. The police let her go with a protective detail, her silence a temporary shield, and Silvaris returned to the train, his 7:45 a.m. ride home a blur of exhaustion, his mind replaying the alley, the gun, the woman's cry. He reached his station, the suburban quiet a stark contrast to the city's chaos, and walked home, his key turning in the lock with a new wariness. The next morning, Silvaris boarded the 7:15 a.m. train again, his nerves frayed, his eyes scanning for Cashin and Rune, their faces etched in his memory. They weren't there, the carriage a mix of familiar faces. Mrs. Fenella knitting a blue shawl, Torin scrolling, his apron a constant. But the tension lingered, his every move cautious. He watched Torin, noting his fidgety hands, his glances toward Mrs. Fenella, and followed him at the city station, the platform crowded with the morning rush. Torin met the man in the green jacket, Soren, near the coffee stand, passing a small package, his movements quick and practiced, his face a mask of nervousness. Silvaris recorded it, his phone steady despite his pounding heart. The exchange another piece of the syndicate's puzzle, Torin's role as a courier becoming clear. He shared the video with Nyx, who identified Soren as a mid-level operative, his green jacket a signature in the syndicate's network. She asked Silvaris to keep watching, a civilian informant, and he agreed, his fear mixing with a growing determination to expose the plot. That evening, as he boarded the train home, a note slipped into his bag during the rush. "Stop looking or you're next." Its paper crisp, its threat cold. Silvaris's blood ran cold, the syndicate's reach extending to his personal space, his daily commute now a battlefield. He called Nyx, his voice shaking, and she promised protection, but the train's isolation, the faces around him, all felt like potential threats, his routine shattered by a conspiracy he couldn't escape. Silvaris clutched the note, its threat a weight in his pocket as he sat on the evening train, the carriage's dim lights casting long shadows over the seats, the hum of conversation a distant murmur. Mrs. Fenella was absent, her knitting corner empty, her absence a void that heightened his unease, while Torin sat a few rows ahead, his hands restless, his eyes darting toward a woman in a red scarf, her posture tense, her bag clutched tightly. Silvaris kept his head down, his tablet a shield, but his mind raced, the note, Torin's involvement, Vespera's beating, all threads of a conspiracy that now ensnared him. He texted Detective Nyx, sharing the note, his fingers trembling as he typed, the train's sway unsteady beneath him. Nyx replied quickly, her message firm. "Don't engage. We're setting a sting for tomorrow's train. Keep recording." Silvaris nodded to himself, his resolve hardening, but the train's isolation amplified his fear. Each stop a potential ambush, each passenger a possible threat, the carriage a trap he couldn't escape. He watched Torin, noting his nervous glances toward the woman in the red scarf, her fingers tracing the bag's zipper, and recorded discreetly, capturing Torin passing her a small envelope, her nod a silent agreement, the exchange a link in the syndicate's chain. The woman left at the next stop, her red scarf a fleeting mark in the crowd, and Silvaris's suspicion deepened. Another courier, another layer to unravel. The next morning, Silvaris boarded the 7:15 a.m. train with a plan. He'd stage a conversation with Mrs. Fenella, loud enough for Torin to hear, saying he'd found evidence and was meeting a detective at the city station. Mrs. Fenella, back in her corner, agreed, her knitting needles pausing as she listened, her eyes sharp with concern. "Be careful, dear," she whispered, her voice a grandmotherly warning, and Silvaris nodded, his heart pounding as he spoke, his words deliberate. "I've got proof, and I'm handing it to the detective at 8 o'clock. Torin overheard, his reaction immediate, texting rapidly, his face pale, his betrayal a silent confession. At the station, Silvaris waited on the platform, his phone recording, as undercover officers positioned themselves nearby, their presence a hidden shield, their radios crackling softly. Torin met Cashin and Rune near the ticket booth, their faces hard, their hands in their pockets, the staged conversation a bait they'd taken. Silvaris's pulse raced as they approached, their intent clear, but before they could act, the officers swarmed, arresting them, their movements swift and precise. Torin confessed on the spot. He'd been a courier for the syndicate, pressured into compliance, his cafe job a cover, his fear a motivator. Cashin and Rune stayed silent, their glares a promise of retribution. But the sting had worked, the train's role in the operation exposed, Silvaris's bravery a key to their capture. Silvaris watched from a distance as the officers cuffed Cashin, Rune, and Torin, the platform a chaos of radios, shouted commands, and curious onlookers, the morning commuters oblivious to the drama unfolding. Detective Nix approached, her face a mix of relief and caution, her wiry frame steady as she took Silvaris' statement, his footage a critical piece of evidence. "You've done more than we could have hoped," she said, her voice calm but firm, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But there's someone higher up, someone pulling the strings. We didn't get them." Silvaris' stomach churned, the victory hollow. Soren, the man in the green jacket, was still out there, and the syndicate's reach extended beyond the train, a shadow over his life. He returned home that evening, his apartment a sanctuary with its familiar scent of old books and coffee. But the fear lingered, every creak of the floorboards a potential threat. He called Vespera, who'd been released from the hospital with a bruised face and a guarded spirit, her voice shaky but grateful. "They threatened my family," she whispered, explaining her silence, her words a mirror to his own fear. Her decision to stay quiet a survival tactic he couldn't judge. Silvaris understood, his involvement a risk he hadn't foreseen, and promised to check on her, their shared ordeal a bond forged in danger. He installed new locks, his hands steady as he turned the key, the click a small comfort, and worked from home the next day. The train's rhythm a memory he couldn't face, its clatter replaced by the hum of his laptop. But a text arrived that night, a photo of his apartment building, time-stamped an hour ago, captioned, "You can't stop us." Silvaris' heart raced, the message traced to a burner phone, Soren's work, his vendetta personal now, Silvaris' interference a direct challenge. He called Nix, who increased patrols around his building, her voice reassuring but cautious, and the photos continued, Silvaris at the grocery store, pushing a cart with tense shoulders, his car in the parking lot, its windows reflecting the dusk, each one a reminder of the syndicate's grip. Elam adjusted his backpack, the straps digging into his shoulders as he guided his partner, Seraphine, onto the 4:30 p.m. train bound for the mountain town of Arinder. It was a crisp October afternoon in 2025, the air tinged with the scent of falling leaves, a welcome break from their hectic lives in the city. At 31, Selim was a software developer, his days spent in front of screens, while Seraphine, 29, a museum curator, craved the quiet of nature after months of exhibit planning. They'd booked seats in a mid-tier carriage for the 3-hour journey, their weekend getaway a chance to hike the autumn trails and unwind, the train platform alive with weekend travelers, families with strollers, solo hikers with gear, their voices a cheerful hum. They boarded, the train's modern design a contrast to the rustic destination, its windows wide and clean, the interior a mix of plush seats and polished wood. Selim found their seats near the window, the view of the city fading as the train pulled out, the rhythmic clack of the tracks a soothing rhythm. Seraphine unpacked a thermos of spiced cider, its warmth a comfort, and snapped a photo of the departing skyline, her dark hair catching the golden light. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her smile bright, and Selim nodded, his hand resting on hers, the stress of their jobs melting away. The carriage was half full, a diverse crowd settling in. 2 teenagers with backpacks played cards, an older man in a tweed cap read a newspaper, and a group of 3 men in hoodies lounged near the back, their laughter loud, their movements rough. Selim noticed one of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, slip a wallet from the older man's bag, his fingers quick, practiced the theft unnoticed. Seraphine nudged him, her voice a whisper. "They're stealing." Selim's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice low. "Let's not draw attention. We'll tell the conductor later." They watched, the unease growing, as the group's leader, a lanky man with a scarred eyebrow, smirked, his eyes scanning the carriage with predatory intent. The train wound through the countryside, the autumn leaves a blaze of orange and red, and Selim tried to focus on the view, but the thieves' presence loomed. Seraphine sipped her cider, her hand tightening on his, and they planned their next move, alerting the conductor at the next stop, a small station an hour away. But then the scarred man stood, his companions following, and approached a wealthy couple in first-class attire, their jewelry glinting, their conversation hushed. Selim recorded discreetly on his phone, the footage shaky but clear, the group's intent a shadow over their getaway, the train's journey now a descent into danger. Selim kept his phone steady, the video capturing the scarred man's approach to the wealthy couple, his companions fanning out, their movements coordinated like a pack of wolves. Seraphine leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. They're planning something big. The carriages' hum masked their whispers, the teenager's card game a distraction, the older man's newspaper rustling oblivious to the threat. Selim nodded, his thumb pausing the recording, and they decided to move toward the conductor's office, the next carriage a safer haven. The train's rhythm steadied, the countryside unfolding in a tapestry of hills, but the tension inside grew, the thieves' presence a dark undercurrent. The scarred man, whom Selim overheard called Ragnar by one of his companions, leaned toward the couple, his voice low but audible. "Nice rings. Hand them over, no fuss." The woman gasped, her husband stiffening, but Ragnar's smirk widened, his hand dipping into his hoodie, revealing a glint of metal, a knife, its edge catching the light. Seraphine's hand tightened on Selim's, her eyes wide, and he sent the video to the conductor's emergency line, his message brief. Thieves with a weapon targeting passengers. The train slowed for a tunnel, the lights flickering, and Ragnar signaled his group, the stocky man with the buzz cut, and a third with a shaved head moving toward the couple, their intent clear. Selim and Seraphine slipped into the next carriage, the dining car, its brighter lights a relief, a few passengers sipping coffee, unaware of the danger. They approached the conductor, a wiry man named Eldrick, his badge glinting, and explained the situation, showing the video. Eldrick's face darkened. "We'll handle it at the next stop, stay here." He radioed for security, his voice tense, but the tunnel's darkness swallowed the train, the lights dimming further, and a scream pierced the air from the previous carriage. Selim's heart raced, Seraphine clutching his arm, and they peered back, the thieves' silhouettes visible through the connecting door, the couple's struggle a shadow play. Eldrick returned, 2 guards with him, their batons drawn, and led the way back, Selim and Seraphine following, their footsteps quick. The carriage was chaos, the couple on the floor, the woman's rings gone, the man bloodied, the thieves fleeing toward the rear. Selim recorded again, the guards pursuing, but the train emerged from the tunnel, the lights steadying, and the thieves vanished into the next section, their laughter a taunt. Eldrick cursed, promising a search, but Selim felt the getaway slipping. The train now a trap, the thieves scheme a threat that wouldn't relent. Selim stood in the dining car, his phone warm in his hand, the video of the thieves' attack a damning record, his breath uneven as Seraphine pressed against him, her face pale. Eldrick and the guards moved through the carriage, their voices sharp with urgency, checking on the couple, the woman sobbing, her husband clutching a bruised jaw, their jewelry gone, their vacation ruined. The teenagers gaped, their card game forgotten, the older man's newspaper crumpled as he offered a handkerchief, the carriage a scene of shock. Selim's mind raced, the thieves' escape into the rear section a puzzle. Were they hiding or planning more? Seraphine whispered, "We can't stay here, they'll come back." Selim agreed, his eyes on the connecting door, and they moved to a corner table, its proximity to the guards a fragile shield. Eldrick returned, his face grim. "They're in the luggage car, off limits, but they've breached it. We'll stop at the next station and call for police." The train's rhythm faltered, the countryside a blur, and Selim recorded the guard's plan, his phone a silent witness. The couple, identified as Lorden and Muriel, gave statements, their voices shaky, the loss of their rings, a family heirloom, deepening their distress. The lights flickered again, a prolonged dimness, and a thud sounded from the luggage car, the door rattling. Ragnar emerged, his scarred eyebrow raised, his knife in hand, his companions flanking him, their hoods pulled low. The dining car erupted, passengers screamed, coffee cups shattered, and Eldrick shouted, "Stand back." Selim pushed Seraphine behind him, his backpack a barrier, and recorded, the footage capturing Ragnar's advance. The stocky man lunged at a guard, his fist connecting, while the shaved-headed thief grabbed a passenger's bag, the chaos a smokescreen. Selim swung his backpack, striking the shaved-headed man, who stumbled, dropping the bag, but Ragnar closed in, his knife slashing toward Selim. Seraphine screamed, grabbing a tray from the table, and swung it at Ragnar, the metal clanging against his arm, the knife skittering away. The guards tackled the stocky man, cuffing him, but Ragnar and the shaved-headed thief fled, the connecting door slamming shut. Eldrick called for an emergency stop, his radio crackling, and Selim held Seraphine, their breaths ragged. The getaway now a fight for survival, the train a battleground they couldn't escape. Selim held Seraphine, her arms trembling around him, the dining car a mess of overturned tables and spilled coffee, the air thick with tension. Eldrick barked orders, the cuffed stocky man, named Goran, spitting curses, his hood pulled back to reveal a bruised face, his arrest a small victory. The guards secured the carriage, checking passengers, Lorden and Muriel shaken but safe, their statements fueling Eldrick's resolve. Selim's phone buzzed with a new video. He'd captured Ragnar's attack, the knife's glint, Seraphine's bravery, a record Eldrick took, promising to share with police at the next stop, a rural station 30 minutes away. Seraphine's voice quivered. "They're not done. They'll come for us." Selim nodded, his eyes on the connecting door, the luggage car a lair for Ragnar and the shaved-headed thief, whose name Goran muttered as Dren. The train slowed, the emergency stop announced, and police boarded, their uniforms a stark contrast to the train's rustic interior. Officer the Lion, a tall man with a weathered face, took charge, reviewing the footage, his expression darkening. "These are the Blackridge crew, thieves with a history of violent heists. We've been tracking them." Goran smirked, refusing to talk, but Thalian's team searched the train, their flashlights cutting through the luggage car's shadows. Selim and Seraphine stayed with the guards, their corner table a refuge, but a shadow passed the window, Ragnar, his scarred eyebrow visible, his knife glinting as he signaled Dren. The police pursued, their shouts echoing, and Selim recorded again, the chase a blur through the glass. A crash sounded, luggage tumbling, and the Lion returned, his face grim. They escaped out a side hatch. "We'll set a perimeter, but they know this train." The couple's fear deepened, the getaway a descent, the thieves' trap tightening around them. The Lion suggested a secure cabin near the front, and Selim and Seraphine followed, their steps heavy, the guards flanking them. The cabin locked with a solid click, but a note slipped under the door. "You interfered. You're next." Selim's stomach dropped, Seraphine clutching his hand, the train's isolation a prison, the thieves' vendetta a shadow they couldn't shake. Selim stared at the note, its threat a cold weight, his hand trembling as he showed Seraphine, her face paling in the cabin's dim light. The secure room, with its reinforced door and narrow window, offered a fragile safety, the guards stationed outside, their radios crackling with updates. Officer the Lion briefed them, his voice steady. "The Blackridge crew targets wealthy passengers. Your video makes you witnesses. We'll protect you, but stay here until Arinder." Selim nodded, his mind racing, Seraphine's hand in his a lifeline, the train's clatter a reminder of their vulnerability. The journey resumed, the countryside a blur, and Selim recorded the cabin, documenting the note, his phone a shield against forgetting. Seraphine unpacked a map, plotting their hike, a distraction, but a thud against the wall jolted them. Ragnar, his scarred face pressed to the window, his knife tapping the glass. Selim shouted, the guards rushing in, but Ragnar vanished, his laughter echoing. Thalian's team searched, finding a vent breached, the thieves inside the train's structure, their audacity chilling. Hours passed, the tension unbearable, and a scream pierced the air from the dining car. Selim and Seraphine followed the Lion, the guards leading, their batons ready. The car was chaos, passengers cowering, Dren holding a woman's purse, Ragnar slashing at a guard, his knife a blur. Selim swung his backpack, striking Dren, who dropped the purse, while Seraphine grabbed a fire extinguisher, spraying Ragnar, the foam blinding him. The Lion tackled Ragnar, cuffing him, but Dren fled, the chase resuming, the train a battlefield. Police reinforcements boarded at Arinder, arresting Ragnar, his threats. "You'll pay," fading as he was dragged off. Dren escaped, but the Lion promised a manhunt, the couple's getaway ruined, their survival a hard-won victory, the train a scar on their memory. Selim and Seraphine disembarked at Arinder, the mountain air crisp but heavy with the aftermath, their weekend plans abandoned for a police station visit. Officer the Lion escorted them, his team searching for Dren, the Blackridge crew's remnants a lingering threat. The station was a flurry of activity, statements taken, the video evidence key to Ragnar's charges, robbery, assault, attempted murder. Muriel and Lorden thanked them, their gratitude a small comfort, but the loss of their rings deepened their sorrow, their vacation a memory tainted. The couple returned home, their apartment a refuge, but the fear persisted, every noise a potential threat. Selim installed security cameras, his hands steady, Seraphine joining a self-defense class, her resolve hardening. A week later, a photo arrived, their apartment window captioned, "Dren remembers." Traced to a burner phone, the thieves escape a shadow. The Lion increased patrols, but the messages continued. Seraphine at work, Selim at the park, each a reminder of the unfinished threat. Selim started a blog, Safe Journeys, sharing their story, warning travelers, his words a call for vigilance, the posts gaining traction. Seraphine found strength in art, her sketches of the train a catharsis, their bond deepened by survival. One evening, a text arrived, a photo of them at dinner captioned, "Always near." Selim reported it, the police suspecting Dren's allies, and though they promised action, the fear lingered. The story ends with Selim locking the door, Seraphine beside him, their eyes on the night, their resolve to live despite the threat unyielding. Ashwin tightened the straps of their backpack, the weight of textbooks and a laptop pressing against their shoulders, a tangible reminder of the grueling semester they'd just survived at university. It was a frosty December evening in 2025. The station platform at Cresthaven dusted with a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot, the air sharp with the promise of a white Christmas that had been a family tradition since childhood. At 21, Ashwin was a third-year biology student, their exams finally behind them, the 5-hour train journey to their rural hometown of Velmont a much-anticipated escape to reunite with their parents and younger sibling, Pippa. The platform buzzed with holiday travelers. Parents juggling strollers and gift-wrapped packages, couples laughing with steaming cups of cocoa, their voices a cheerful chorus that mingled with the whistle of the approaching 6 p.m. train. Ashwin adjusted their scarf, the wool itchy but warm, and watched the locomotive's lights pierce the dusk, its silver body gleaming under the station's festive lights strung with red and green bulbs. They boarded, stepping into the train's interior, which felt warm but dated, its faded blue seats worn from years of use, the overhead lights flickering faintly as if struggling against the winter gloom. The carriage smelled of damp wool and stale coffee, a contrast to the holiday spirit outside, and Ashwin found a seat in the second-to-last carriage, the last one marked with a yellowed sign taped crookedly that read "Out of service, do not enter." They settled near the window, their breath fogging the glass, and pulled out a sketchbook, its pages creased from travel, their pencil tracing the outline of a snowy tree. A gift for Pippa, who loved nature drawings. The carriage was sparsely populated, a quiet haven amid the holiday rush. A woman with a red coat, her name tag revealing her as Maris, a middle-aged librarian, sat across the aisle, her nose buried in a thick novel, her fingers turning pages with a soft rustle. A man in a plaid shirt, his graying hair disheveled, dozed 2 rows ahead, his snores a low rumble, his suitcase propped carelessly beside him. A teenager with dyed purple hair, later introduced as Zirin, slouched near the back, their earbuds blasting music audible as a faint thump, their phone screen glowing with a game. The train lurched forward at 6:05 p.m., the city lights of Cresthaven fading into the snowy expanse, the tracks clattering beneath in a rhythm that soothed Ashwin's nerves after weeks of study. They sketched, the pencils scratch a comforting sound, the tree taking shape with delicate branches, when a faint thud echoed from the last carriage, its connecting door slightly ajar despite the sign. Ashwin paused, their hand hovering, the sound repeating, a heavy, deliberate knock, like someone testing the walls or dragging something across the floor. They glanced up, catching Maris's eye, her brow furrowing as she lowered her book, her lips parting in silent question. The man in plaid slept on, oblivious, his snores unbroken, while Zirin remained engrossed in their game, the earbuds a barrier to the world. Ashwin's curiosity battled their caution, the holiday cheer evaporating, and they stood, their knees creaking from sitting, peering through the door's smudged glass. A shadow moved inside, tall and broad, its outline indistinct but menacing, dragging what looked like a heavy bag, black, bulky, its contents shifting with a sickening thud. Ashwin's heart raced, their breath catching, the festive mood shattered by a sense of dread, and they sat back down, their sketchbook slipping to the seat, debating whether to investigate or alert the conductor. The train's intercom crackled, the conductor's voice distorted but clear. Next stop, Haverton, in 1 hour. Please remain seated. Ashwin nodded to themselves, their decision to wait firm, their eyes darting to the door, the shadow's movement ceasing but its presence lingering. They pulled their phone from their pocket, its screen cold against their fingers, and opened the camera, recording the door as a precaution, the footage shaky but capturing the ajar sign, the dim interior beyond. The carriage settled into an uneasy silence, the clatter of tracks a stark contrast to the tension, when a scream cut through, sharp, desperate, emanating from the last section. Maris dropped her novel, the pages fluttering, her hands flying to her mouth, while the man jolted awake, his eyes wide with confusion. Zirin yanked out their earbuds, their face paling, the game forgotten, and Ashwin stood again, their phone still rolling, the shadow now still. The screams echo a chilling prelude to a journey turned deadly. The holiday escape now a trap they couldn't foresee. Ashwin's phone trembled in their hand, the video capturing the last carriage's door, the shadow's movement a dark blur against the dim interior, the screams still reverberating in their ears like a warning bell. The woman in the red coat, Maris, stood abruptly, her novel sliding to the floor, her voice shaky as she said, "We need the conductor, now, before it's too late." The man in the plaid shirt, his graying hair mussed from sleep, rubbed his eyes, muttering, "Probably just a prank, kids messing around." But his tone lacked conviction, his hands gripping the seat's armrests as if anchoring himself. The teenager with purple hair, Zirin, stepped forward, their sneakers scuffing the carpet, whispering their name in a rush. "I'm Zirin, let's stick together," and joined Ashwin, their phone also recording, a second pair of eyes on the unfolding horror, their game screen dark. They moved as a trio toward the front, the dining car a brighter space with its warm yellow lights, a handful of passengers sipping hot cocoa, the festive decorations, paper snowflakes and tinsel, hanging ironically over their fear. The air smelled of cinnamon and melted chocolate, a cruel contrast to the dread creeping in. Ashwin found the conductor, a stern woman named Vinara, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform crisp despite the late hour, and explained the screen, their voice trembling as they showed the video. Vinara's expression hardened, her lips thinning. "That section's off limits, maintenance issues, supposed to be locked. Stay here while I check." She radioed for a guard, her voice clipped and authoritative, and headed to the last carriage, her flashlight beam cutting through the dimness, its circle of light bobbing as she disappeared beyond the door. Ashwin, Zirin, and Maris waited near the dining car's counter, the passengers' chatter fading into whispers, the cocoa cups cooling on tables. Maris picked up her novel, her fingers tracing the cover, a nervous habit, while Zirin fidgeted with their earbuds, their eyes on the connecting door. Minutes stretched, the train's rhythm a steady clack against the snowy landscape outside, when Vinara returned, her face pale, her hands trembling as she whispered to a guard, "There's a body, fresh, still warm." Ashwin overheard, their stomach lurching, bile rising, and Zirin's gasp drew Maris's attention, the trio exchanging horrified glances. The dining car fell silent, the festive lights dimming in their perception, and Vinara addressed the passengers, her voice steady but strained. "Remain seated. We've found a situation in the rear section. Police will board at Haverton. Do not panic." Ashwin's mind raced, a body, a shadow, a scream. The last carriage held a murderer, and they were trapped on the train with them, the holiday journey now a nightmare. Zirin whispered, "Should we run?" But Ashwin shook their head. "We're safer together." The lights flickered, a prolonged dimness that plunged the car into near darkness, and a figure appeared at the dining car's entrance. The shadow from the last carriage, now clear. A tall man in a black coat, his face gaunt, his eyes cold and unblinking, a bloodied knife dangling from his hand, its blade catching the faint light. Maris screamed, the sound piercing, her novel dropping again, while Zirin froze, their phones slipping. Ashwin recorded, their hands steady despite the fear, the man's voice a low growl. "No one leaves until I'm done. Keep quiet, or you're next." He vanished into the next carriage, the guard pursuing with a shout, but the train's isolation, the snowy expanse outside blanketing any hope of escape, made the situation dire, the holiday spirit replaced by a terror they couldn't shake. Ashwin's heart pounded, their phones still recording as the man in the black coat disappeared, his threat. "No one leaves until I'm done." A chilling promise that hung in the air like frost. Vinara locked the dining car doors, her hands fumbling with the latch, her voice urgent. Stay here, all of you. Don't open these unless I say. The guard, a burly man named Orwin, returned breathless, his uniform streaked with sweat. He's moving through the train, fast, like he knows the layout. Maris clutched her novel to her chest, her knuckles white, her lips moving in silent prayers while Zirin whispered, "We're sitting ducks, trapped with a psycho." Ashwin nodded, their mind racing. The killer was playing a game, using the train's segmented design to evade capture. The last carriage his lair, the body a warning shot in a deadly hunt. The dining car's passengers huddled near the windows, the cocoa cups abandoned, the festive paper snowflakes swaying slightly with the train's motion, a mockery of their fear. Ashwin shared the video with Vinara, who forwarded it to the police via her radio, the device crackling with static as she spoke. 2 carriages compromised, suspect armed, 2 victims confirmed. Haverton was 45 minutes away, but the snowstorm outside, its flakes thick against the windows, slowed the train, the tracks icing over, the journey stretching into a perilous unknown. Maris spoke, her voice trembling. "I saw him earlier, near the station, arguing with a man in a suit, loud and angry. Maybe that's the victim." Ashwin recalled the heavy bag, its shifting contents, their suspicion growing. The victim, stashed in the last carriage, a murder hidden amid the holiday rush, the killer's motive tied to that confrontation. A thud echoed from above, the ceiling creaking with a groan, and Vinara shone her flashlight upward, revealing a vent grille swinging loose, its screws dangling. The killer was in the train's structure, moving like a predator through the ducts, and Ashwin's fear spiked. They were being hunted from within. Zirin suggested barricading the doors further, and they worked together, piling tables and chairs against the entrances, the passengers helping, their hands shaking but determined, the clatter of furniture a stark contrast to the silence that followed. The lights flickered again, a prolonged dimness that deepened the dread, and a scream pierced the air from the third carriage, its pitch raw and terrified. Vinara radioed for backup, her voice breaking. "He's struck again. Send help now." Her plea lost in the storm's howl outside. Orwin led a search, Ashwin and Zirin following, their phones recording, Maris staying to guard the dining car with a makeshift weapon, a metal tray. They navigated the third carriage, its seats empty, the air thick with a metallic scent, and found a second body. A man in a suit, his throat slashed, his briefcase open, papers scattered across the floor, stamped with a corporate logo, Velmont Mining Company. Ashwin's footage captured the scene, the blood pooling, the killer's game clear. He was eliminating witnesses, his motive tied to the briefcase, the train a killing ground, the holiday passengers his prey, each carriage a step closer to their own danger. Ashwin stood over the second body, their phone trembling, the man in the suit's lifeless eyes staring upward, the blood pooling beneath his head a stark contrast to the carriage's faded upholstery. The papers around him, stamped with the Velmont Mining Company logo, fluttered slightly with the train's motion, their edges curling with dampness from the snow outside. Zirin whispered, their voice hoarse. He worked for a mining company, maybe the killer's after something he had, like blackmail or a deal gone wrong. Vinara nodded, her flashlight beam steady on the papers, her voice low. "Looks like a contract. Land rights, big money involved, possibly disputed claims." Ashwin's mind connected the dots. The killer, likely tied to the mining industry, was eliminating anyone who knew about the contract, the last carriage his hiding spot, the train his trap, the holiday journey a deadly stage. Orwin radioed for police, his voice tense over the static. "We've got 2 bodies, suspect on the move, armed and dangerous." The train slowed further, the storm worsening, snow piling on the tracks, its white blanket visible through the frosted windows. Haverton now an hour away as the ice delayed their progress. Ashwin and Zirin returned to the dining car, Maris relieved to see them, her tray raised like a shield, but a shadow passed the window. The killer, his black coat stark against the snow, climbing onto the roof with an agility that defied the storm. Vinara cursed under her breath. "He's trying to escape, or flank us from above." Orwin led a team to the roof, their boots clanging on the metal, the sound muffled by the storm's howl. But the wind drowned their shouts, their flashlights bobbing like lost stars. Inside, Ashwin suggested a plan. Use the train's intercom to lure the killer, pretending to know his motive and offering a false negotiation. Vinara agreed, her radio in hand, and broadcast a message. We know about Velmont Mining, surrender now, or we expose the contract. The lights dimmed again, a crash sounding from the roof, the metal groaning, and the killer dropped into the fourth carriage, his knife slashing at a guard, blood spraying across the seats, the guard's cry cut short. Ashwin recorded, Zirin grabbing the tray as a weapon, their hands steady despite the panic, and they fought back, the tray striking the killer's arm with a dull thud, his knife skittering across the floor, its blade embedding in a seat. Orwin tackled him, his bulk pinning the killer momentarily, but the man broke free with a feral strength, his coat tearing, fleeing toward the front carriage, the hunt intensifying with each step. Police updates crackled through Venara's radio, reinforcements at Haverton, but the storm delayed them, the train's isolation a prison. Ashwin and Zirin barricaded the fourth carriage with seats and luggage, their breaths ragged, Maris joining them from the dining car, her tray now a symbol of their resistance. The killer's game was unraveling, his desperation making him deadlier. The train a maze they had to navigate, each carriage a battlefield, the holiday spirit a distant memory as survival became their only goal. Ashwin's hands shook, their phone capturing the chaos in the fourth carriage, the guard's blood staining the floor in dark pools, the killer's escape a fleeting shadow toward the front, his black coat disappearing around the corner. Venara radioed for medics, her voice breaking with urgency. We're losing control. Send medical support to carriage 4. Zirin clutched the tray, their purple hair matted with sweat and streaked with the guard's blood, while Maris whispered prayers, her novel abandoned on a seat, her hands clasped tightly. Ashwin reviewed the footage, their fingers slippery on the screen, spotting a tattoo on the killer's wrist. A miner's pickaxe, its lines jagged, tying him to Velmont Mining, his motive growing clearer. Revenge or greed, the contract a trigger for his murderous spree across the train. Orwin returned, his arm bandaged with a strip torn from his uniform, his face grim. He's heading for the engine. Might try to stop the train or derail it to cover his tracks. Venara led a team forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. Ashwin and Zirin following, their phones recording, Maris staying to guard the injured guard with a blanket and her tray. The engine car was a cramped space of levers and gauges, the driver, a stout man named Halric with a gray beard. Panicking as the killer burst in, his knife raised, the blade glinting with fresh blood. Ashwin swung their backpack, the weight of textbooks striking the killer's legs with a solid thump, knocking him off balance, while Zirin tackled him, the tray a shield that clanged against his chest. Halric hit the emergency brake, the train lurching violently, passengers tumbling, and Orwin seized the moment, his good arm cuffing the killer, the metal clicking shut around his wrists. The killer struggled, his gaunt face contorted, his tattoo visible, and Venara shone her light on him, confirming his identity. Draven, a former miner fired after a strike, his family evicted when Velmont Mining seized their land for the contract. His confession spilled out, his voice hoarse. They took everything. I killed their agents to stop the deal, to make them pay. Ashwin's footage captured it all, the police boarding at Haverton, their flashlights cutting through the snow, arresting Draven as he cursed, his knife confiscated, the train's journey a nightmare survived. The holiday escape had ended in blood, the last carriage a tomb they'd escaped, the contract's scandal a legacy they'd helped expose. Ashwin disembarked at Velmont, the snowy platform a stark contrast to the train's horrors, the cold biting their cheeks as their family waited. Pippa's small frame rushing forward with a hug, their parents' faces etched with relief, their voices a mix of joy and concern. The police took statements in a heated station office. Draven's arrest headline news across the region. The Velmont Mining Company contract a scandal that sparked investigations into land rights abuses, the company's executives scrambling to respond. Maris and Zirin exchanged numbers with Ashwin, their bond forged in the train's terror, promising to stay in touch, the carriage a shared scar they'd carry. The guard, stabilized by medics, offered a weak nod of thanks, his survival a testament to their bravery. Back home, Ashwin decorated the Christmas tree with Pippa, the scent of pine filling the room, their sketch of the snowy tree a gift that brought smiles, its branches now adorned with ornaments. But the fear lingered, every creak of the house a reminder of Draven, every shadow outside a potential threat. They installed a security system, the red light blinking above the door, their room a sanctuary with locked windows, and joined a support group for trauma survivors, their story a warning to others about holiday travel risks. A week later, a letter arrived. No return address, just a photo of their house taken at dusk, captioned, "Draven had friends who won't forget." Ashwin's stomach dropped, the police tracing it to a former miner, an ally of Draven's, arrested after a brief chase, but the threat echoed, the mining community's resentment a shadow over their peace. Ashwin started a journal, Tracks of Survival, sharing their ordeal in detailed entries, their words a call for awareness about hidden dangers on trains, the pages gaining readers online, a community of survivors commenting with support. "Your courage saved us from ignorance." Seraphine found strength in sketching the train's interior, her drawings a catharsis, their bond with Maris and Zirin deepened by shared survival. One evening, as they locked the doors with their family beside them, a text arrived, a photo of them at the local market, the snow falling gently, captioned, "We're watching always." Ashwin reported it to the police, who suspected Draven's remaining allies, promising increased patrols, but the fear remained a quiet companion. They stood taller, their resolve to live despite the threat unyielding, the holiday a memory of resilience, the last carriage a lesson in vigilance they'd never forget, the train's clatter a distant echo as they faced the night together.